The night lay heavy upon the countryside. A velvet shroud spread over fields that stretched beyond the eye, cloaking barns, fences, and forest edges in a silence so deep that even the nocturnal creatures seemed to hesitate before breaking it. The stars above flickered coldly, but their light was thin, barely enough to touch the weather-worn planks of the barn where a child stirred. His breathing came in shallow, uneven bursts, chest rising and falling beneath a tattered scrap of blanket that was far too small to fend off the sharp bite of the late-season chill. He was no older than 4, yet his tiny frame bore the weight of fear that belonged more to men on battlefields than to children meant for lullabies. His hands, small and cracked from exposure, clutched that scrap of cloth with a desperation that only the abandoned know, his knuckles whitening as though if he let go, the last tether of familiarity in his fractured world would vanish with it. For hours he had hidden there, curled in the barn's darkest corner where broken tools and old hay gathered like forgotten relics. The scent of straw and earth mixed with the faint musk of animals long since moved elsewhere, their stalls empty now, their warmth only a memory that lingered faintly in the wood. The silence pressed in on him. It wasn't the ordinary hush of a countryside night. No, this was a silence that seemed aware, watchful, as though it knew the child was there, listening with him, holding its breath in sympathy or warning. Shivered. The cold seeped into his bones. But worse than the chill was the memory that gnawed at him, the sudden chaos that had torn apart his world. Too young to understand the politics of land, blood, and war, he only knew the cries that had ripped through the night, the flames that had licked across familiar places, the strong arms that had tried to carry him to safety and then lost hold. In the confusion, he had run. He had not known where his feet carried him, only that they must keep moving. That shadows behind him were full of men and danger and loss. And somehow, those hurried little steps had brought him here, to the barn of strangers, where exhaustion had finally dragged him down into an easy sleep. Now he was awake again. Though his eyes remained shut, the darkness behind his eyelids no different from that around him. The silence was too deep. He tried to pull the blanket closer, but it barely covered his shoulders. His stomach ached with hunger, a gnawing emptiness he could not name but felt sharply. He wanted to cry, to call out for the voice he missed most, but even at 4, some instinct held him still. To make noise would be to invite whatever hunted the night closer, and though his young mind could not frame the thought fully, his heart knew it well. Then came the first sound. At first it was so faint that he thought it must be part of a dream. A dull thud that trembled faintly through the packed earth floor. He stiffened, holding his breath, eyes opening wide in the dark. Another thud followed. Then another. They were not the scurrying of small animals, not the shifting groan of wood in the wind. These were heavy, deliberate footfalls, the kind that belong to men who carry weight, men who know where they are going. The child froze. His little fingers curled tighter into the blanket until the fabric dug painfully into his skin. The sound multiplied. No longer a single pair of steps, but many layered upon one another. Thud, thud, thud. They came in rhythm, steady, measured, as though each step was a drumbeat. It was not the chaotic scatter of raiders or the desperate run of villagers. No, this was something organized, something vast. The ground seemed to answer them, carrying their vibration through the soil, up the wooden beams of the barn, and into the trembling body of the boy. He pressed his ear to the floor and heard it more clearly. Dozens of feet, maybe more. His young mind tried to count, but they were too many. The rhythm swelled, rising from dozens into what felt like hundreds. It was as though the earth itself had grown restless and now marched across the fields toward him. The sound was neither hurried nor frantic. It was deliberate. Each step landed with the certainty of purpose, with the kind of weight that told the boy instinctively that this was no passing patrol, no wandering band of travelers. Whoever they were coming together, united, as if called by some unseen hand to converge on this place, on this moment. Fear tightened around him like iron bands. His breaths came fast and shallow, his chest fluttering like a trapped bird. He wanted to run, but his legs would not obey. Instead, he sank deeper into the hay, trying to make himself small, almost wishing he could vanish into the earth. The footsteps grew louder still. He could almost see them in his mind now, the dark silhouettes against the horizon, moving in formation, their torches flickering like stars that had fallen to the ground and now marched in a river of flame. 4-year-old cannot name destiny, but he can feel it. And as the sound swelled to a thunder that shook his hiding place, the child realized dimly that the world outside the barn was not the same world he had known. Whatever had turned his life upside down had not ended. It was only beginning, and its footsteps were drawing nearer, steady, deliberate, unstoppable. The silence of the night was no longer silence at all. It was a canvas upon which the march of hundreds was painting itself, stroke by stroke, footfall by footfall. And the boy, shivering in his corner with nothing but a scrap of blanket to shield him, became the unwilling witness to the sound of history approaching, a tide of men and fate pressing closer with every beat of the earth. The boy's heart beat so loudly in his chest that it seemed to echo inside his small frame, a drum that no one else could hear, but which threatened to burst through his ribs at any moment. For the longest time he had kept his eyes squeezed shut, convincing himself that if he didn't look, the sounds outside would vanish, as if they had never existed. But the earth did not stop shaking beneath the steady march of footsteps, and the air did not cease trembling with that slow, deliberate rhythm. Curiosity and terror wrestled within him, until finally, with a courage that surprised even himself, he shifted slightly in the hay. His tiny fingers dug into the dry stalks, scratching his palms, as he crawled closer to the barn wall. The wood was rough, splintered with age, but through a thin crack between two planks he pressed one eye, hardly daring to breathe. What he saw stole the air from his lungs. The horizon, which only moments ago had been a pale stretch of morning mist, was no longer empty. It had become a living thing, trembling with movement. At first, his young mind tried to make sense of it, and he thought perhaps it was a storm rolling in, a dark mass sweeping across the fields. But storms do not carry fire. Storms do not march in lines. This was no weather. This was men. Many men that the boy's ability to count, still barely learned, failed him entirely. Torches swayed in the mist, like restless fireflies, hundreds of them, their flames licking upward in defiance of the dawn. The firelight reflected off the drifting fog, making the world look half dream, half nightmare, as if he were peering into another realm. He pressed closer to the crack, his tiny nose scraping the wood, his breath fogging the surface. His body trembled not only from fear, but from the sheer immensity of what he was witnessing. The lines of light grew clearer as they approached. No longer a haze, but ordered ranks of men moving with uncanny precision. They did not scatter like villagers, or wander like raiders. These were warriors. Even at 4 years old, he could sense it. Their steps thundered in unison, each footfall answering the last. The sound reverberating through the earth like a heartbeat of something larger than themselves. The boy's gaze darted from torch to torch, trying to follow them all at once, but they stretched far too wide. He realized, with dawning awe and dread, that they filled the horizon itself, reaching from one end of the field to the other. It was as if the earth had birthed them, as if the soil had split open and poured forth. An army forged of fire and shadow. His little hands gripped the edge of the wall until splinters bit into his skin, but he barely noticed. And then, through the mist, their faces emerged. He saw them first in fragments, the gleam of dark hair bound with feathers, the sharp lines of painted cheeks, the shimmer of beads that caught torchlight with each step. Their eyes, even from a distance, held a solemn fire, not wild but purposeful, as if every man knew why he was there and carried that reason in his heart like a torch of its own. The boy had never seen so many faces at once. Each one was unfamiliar, yet together they formed something that felt eternal, larger than any village or settlement he had ever known. These were not simply men, they were warriors bound by something greater than themselves. The mist curled around them, clinging to their legs like a shroud that could not slow them, only mark their passage. Their breath rose in unison with the rhythm of their march, plumes of steam glowing faintly in the morning light, as if the land itself exhaled with them. The boy, pressed against the barn wall, felt as though he were watching giants, not merely in size, though some towered taller than any man he had seen, but in presence. Each figure seemed to carry the weight of generations, of battles fought and survived, of ancestors walking beside them. The torches moved higher now, casting stronger light, and with it came the realization of just how many they were. At first, he had thought dozens, then perhaps 100. But the lines did not end. For every rank that passed into view, another rose behind it, and then another. The horizon was alive, a river of warriors flowing steadily toward him, endless and unstoppable. The boy's mouth fell open in silence, awe holding his fear at bay for a fleeting moment. He could hear them now, not only their steps but the subtle sounds that traveled with them, the faint jingle of beads and ornaments, the low murmur of voices carried on the wind, the occasional snort of horses among them, though most moved on foot. There was no shouting, no chaos, only unity. Each sound blended into the rhythm of the march, as if every warrior knew his place in a song too ancient for the boy to recognize. For a moment, he forgot his fear entirely. His small heart, though still beating fast, now pounded not only from terror but from wonder. Never in his short life had he seen anything so vast, so alive with purpose. It was beautiful in a way he could not yet name, terrifying in its immensity, mesmerizing in its power. The boy shifted slightly, trying to take in more, and the crack in the wood widened just enough for him to glimpse the detail of their garments. Leather vests, some adorned with fringe, others decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the light of the torches. Feathers swayed from braids and headdresses, symbols of honor and heritage that the boy could not understand but instinctively respected. Spears and bows glimmered faintly in the firelight, arrows fletched with colored feathers rising above shoulders like wings. But it was their faces that held him captive. So solemn, so certain, not angry, not cruel, but unyielding, as if they carried within them a truth that could not be denied. And though he was only 4, something deep inside, the boy whispered that what he was seeing was not merely men arriving at a barn. This was history unfolding, a story larger than himself, larger even than the barn that shielded him. He was a witness to a tide that could not be stopped. His breath came shallow. He pressed his forehead to the wood, closing his eyes again, as if to hold the vision inside him like a secret, but even behind his eyelids, he saw them still, torches, flickering in mist, warriors advancing with the weight of mountains, faces etched with purpose. He had no words for destiny, but in that moment, he felt it wrapping around him, a cloak of inevitability. The world beyond his hiding place was shifting, and whatever these warriors sought, whatever solemn purpose filled their march, it was drawing him into its orbit whether he wished it or not. For a child so small, the realization was both terrifying and strangely comforting. He was alone, yes, but he was not unseen. Something vast had arrived, something greater than fear itself, and so he stayed at the wall, trembling, eyes wide, watching as the horizon delivered its army of fire and shadow closer and closer, until the very earth beneath him felt alive with their steps, and the barn seemed no longer a shelter but the center of a story that was only just beginning. The boy pulled away from the narrow slit in the barn wall, as if the very sight of what lay beyond had burned his eye. His small chest heaved, rising and falling too quickly, his breaths coming in shallow gasps that seemed far too loud in the silence of the barn. The hay rustled beneath him as he scrambled back into the shadows, and each crackling sound felt like thunder to his ears. He was only 4, yet he understood instinctively that he must be quiet, must be still, for something immense and unstoppable was sweeping toward him. And though the barn seemed to hold him safely within its wooden ribs, he could feel its timbers quivering with the distant march, as though the building itself sensed the weight of what approached. His little hands pressed against the packed earth floor, the dirt cool against his palms, grounding him as his mind swirled with confusion and dread. Never had he felt so small, so utterly fragile, as in this moment. He tried to shrink into himself, pulling his knees tight against his chest, curling his body into the mound of hay in the corner. If he could bury himself deep enough, perhaps they would not see him. Perhaps the warriors would pass, their solemn faces turned elsewhere, their torches burning for reasons that had nothing to do with him. But the thought crumbled almost as soon as it formed. Deep in his chest, deeper than words could reach, he knew they had not come by chance. Their march, their unity, their very presence seemed drawn by an invisible thread that ended here. At this barn, where he sat alone in the dark, the weight of that truth pressed down on him, heavier than the thick air of the barn, heavier than the footsteps that seemed to shake the ground itself. At first, he thought it was just fear, making him imagine things, the way a child imagines shadows at night. Yet the sensation did not leave, it grew. The air inside the barn thickened not with smoke or mist, but with presence, an invisible gravity that told him he was not simply hiding from danger. He was the reason it was here. The boy's heart pounded so fiercely that he could feel it against his ribs. A trapped bird battering its wings against a cage. He pressed his hands to his chest as if he could silence it, afraid the warriors might somehow hear the frantic drumming through the walls. He closed his eyes, but closing them only made the sounds outside sharper, the synchronized thunder of footsteps. The deep hum of voices carried low on the wind, the faint crackle of torches, fire alive even in the damp morning mist, and underneath it all, something else, a rhythm too steady to be coincidence, too vast to belong to mere men. It was as if the earth itself had joined their march, as though each footfall was an echo of something ancient and eternal. His tiny body trembled, yet within that trembling was a strange recognition. He did not understand who they were or what they sought, but he felt the pull of it all the same, as though his small soul recognized what his young mind could not name. A whisper inside him, voiceless but undeniable, said, "They are here for you." The boy curled tighter, pressing his face into the hay, inhaling its dry, dusty scent until it scratched his nose and filled his lungs. The stalks poked his skin, prickling him, grounding him in the tangible, the ordinary. He wanted desperately to stay in that small, ordinary world, the world of hay and wood and silence. But even here, surrounded by the familiar, he could not escape the enormity pressing in from outside. Every creak of the barn, every shift of air through the cracks in its walls, carried the echo of 200 warriors drawing closer. Time stretched, warped by fear, each second elongating until it felt like minutes, each minute like hours. The boy lay frozen, too afraid to look again through the crack, yet unable to silence the images imprinted in his mind. Faces painted with solemn fire, torches swaying like restless spirits, the endless line of warriors emerging through mist, like a tide without end. Even in the dark of the barn, with his eyes squeezed shut, he saw them. Even in silence, he heard them. They were not outside anymore. They were inside him, filling him with dread that grew heavier with every passing moment. He wondered, as children do, if perhaps the barn itself could shield him, not just physically, but completely, if its walls could make him invisible. Yet, he knew barns were not made to hide boys from armies. Barns were made to keep animals safe, to store hay and tools. Its walls were thin, its gaps too wide, its door too frail. Against the weight of 200 men moving as one, the barn was nothing but a shell. He felt it with certainty, though he could not put it into words. This place was not strong enough to keep him from what was coming, and so he prayed. Though prayer was not something he fully understood, he did not know words of ritual or chants of old, but his heart spoke in its own language, raw and wordless, a plea, a cry, a desperate hope, that something greater than himself might hear him and shield him. Perhaps the barn, ancient and weathered, might hold some spirit of protection. Perhaps the hay, grown from the earth itself, might wrap him in invisibility. Or perhaps the warriors, when they arrived, might see not a boy, but nothing at all. But, even as he prayed, he knew the truth. They would see him. They had come too far, moved with too much purpose, to turn away at the sight of old wood and hay. They had not gathered by accident. They were not searching blindly. They were drawn, step by step, by the same invisible thread he felt tightening around his chest. The boy pressed his forehead to his knees, trying to make himself smaller, so small that he might vanish entirely. Yet even as he curled inward, the sensation grew stronger. The warrior's presence was like a storm pressing against the barn walls, each gust a reminder that hiding could not last forever. It was only a matter of time before the storm broke through, and when it did, they would not find an empty barn. They would find him. In his smallness, in his silence, he felt the enormity of destiny settle upon him. It was not a thought he could name, not an idea he could reason through, but an instinct as certain as hunger or fear. The barn trembled not because of footsteps alone, but because the world outside had shifted, drawn into alignment with something he could neither escape nor understand, and he, a boy of only 4 years, sat at its center. He clutched a fistful of hay so tightly that the stalks broke in his hand, crumbling to dust between his fingers. He did not cry out, though tears welled hot in his eyes. He would not move, would not breathe louder than the faintest whisper. But deep within him, a truth rang clear. This was not chance. They had come for him, and though terror burned through his veins, a tiny spark of something else flickered beneath it. Something unnamed, something that felt like the edge of a story far larger than himself. The boy pressed himself deeper into the shadows, yet no amount of stillness could quiet the thunder that grew outside. At first, it was faint, a distant vibration, like the murmur of a storm that had not yet reached the valley. But with each passing breath, it swelled, until the very ground beneath the barn quivered as though alive. Dust drifted from the rafters with each tremor, specks of it catching what little moonlight crept through the wooden slats. The barn was no longer silent. It breathed with the cadence of the warrior's approach, every synchronized footstep sending invisible ripples that reached even the boy's small, curled frame. It was not merely the weight of men upon the earth that shook him, but the unity of their movement. 200 steps fell as one, as if 200 hearts beat to the same rhythm, as if 200 voices drew their strength from a single breath. The boy, though only 4 years old, sensed the enormity of it. No army of farmers or townsmen could move this way, with such cohesion, with such inevitability. Each step seemed born of tradition, rehearsed not by choice but by blood, as if the march itself had been carried down through generations. The earth did not resist them. It yielded, recognizing its own children returning to claim their place. Then came the sound, low, deep, and resonant voices rising together in a chant that seemed older than the soil. The boy had never heard such tones before. They did not sound like words, not in the way he knew them. They sounded like the river's current made audible, like the whisper of the wind through endless trees, like the groan of mountains shifting after centuries of stillness. The sounds seemed to emerge from everywhere at once, filling the air, the ground, even the boy's chest, until it felt as if his own heart had been folded into their rhythm. It was not frightening in the way of monsters or storms, but it carried a weight that crushed the boy's smallness beneath it. Each note of their chant seemed to press on his bones, to remind him that he was not simply hiding from men. He was hiding from history itself, from voices that had carried across centuries, from footsteps that had walked before he was born and would walk long after he was gone. The barn walls trembled faintly, wooden planks creaking in protest, as if the building understood it had not been built to withstand such a force. Its beams, meant to hold up against wind and rain, seemed to shudder beneath the vibrations of something far older, far greater. The boy felt it too. The silence that had once comforted him, the soft hush of hay, the stillness of animals long since gone, no longer seemed protective. Instead, it seemed brittle, a thin shell of calm stretched across the surface of a storm too vast to contain. Then came the torches. At first, only a faint glow reached through the cracks of the barn wall, a soft suggestion of fire against the darkness, but the glow multiplied, growing brighter, until the boy realized it was not a single flame but many dozens, perhaps hundreds, carried by hands that moved steadily closer. Their light licked the mist, painting the air in hues of orange and gold. Through the slats, he glimpsed them, small suns burning against the night, scattered stars brought down from the sky to encircle him. Each flicker illuminated the faint outline of a face, Dark eyes set with unyielding purpose, features painted in ritual strokes that the boy could not comprehend but instinctively feared. The torches did not waver. They advanced as one, like fire, disciplined by centuries of command. Each flame a soldier in its own right. To the boy, it was as though the night itself was surrendering. Darkness, once a blanket that had hidden him, was pierced by so many flames that it seemed to bleed away, leaving him exposed even within the barn's frail refuge. He no longer believed he was invisible. How could he be, when 200 eyes marched with firelight reflected in their gaze? When 200 voices sang a song that shook the marrow of his bones? He pressed his tiny hands against his ears to block the sound, but the chant only grew louder inside him. It was not a noise he could shut out. It was something that lived beneath sound, vibrating through the air, through the ground, through his very blood. It belonged to the world itself, and because he was part of the world, it belonged to him too. The thought terrified him more than anything that even hiding, even silent, even unseen, he was still connected to them, still part of this vastness converging upon him. The barn seemed to shrink around him as the torches drew closer. The shadows that had once hidden him now twisted and bent in the firelight seeping through the cracks. No longer blankets of safety but jagged shapes that seemed to reach for him. The hay beneath him no longer felt like a cushion. It felt brittle, fragile, ready to ignite at the mere touch of flame. Every detail of the barn, every sound and scent, felt temporary, fleeting, as though it might dissolve at any moment under the pressure building outside. He thought of running, of darting through the barn doors, of slipping into the forest, of vanishing into the night like a rabbit into the brush. But the thought died as quickly as it came. The chants were too many, the footsteps too steady, the fire too bright. There was no corner dark enough, no path hidden enough to escape to. 100 warriors moving with one purpose. Running would only draw their eyes to him sooner. He knew it, even if he could not say why. So he stayed, trembling, curled into himself, trying to make his body smaller, his breath quieter, his heartbeat softer. Yet nothing he did could change the truth. The world was closing in. Each footstep outside was another nail in the coffin of his hiding place. Another reminder that silence was no longer a refuge but a fragile illusion. The boy had never known such a sensation before, the feeling of inevitability. Until now, his world had been small and malleable. If he cried, someone might soothe him. If he ran, he might escape. If he hid, he might not be found. But this was different. No cry would drown out the chant. No sprint would outpace the march. No hiding place would withstand the light of 100 torches. This was not a danger he could escape. It was a destiny that had found him. The chants swelled louder, filling the air until it vibrated with sound. The boy could almost make out patterns in it now, rhythms that seemed to speak of triumph, of remembrance, of summoning. He did not know the language, but he felt the meaning, heavy and undeniable. The torches flared brighter, illuminating the mist until the barn seemed surrounded by a wall of fire. And in that moment, the boy understood what it meant for the world itself to close in. The night had betrayed him, offering no shadows. The barn had betrayed him, offering no safety. Even his own body betrayed him, shaking with fear too loud to silence. There was nothing left between him and them. The shell of silence cracked. It was only a matter of time before it shattered completely. The barn was dark, but it was not the kind of darkness that brought comfort. It was the kind of darkness that felt alive, crowded with sounds, shapes, and sensations that the boy could not escape. He pressed himself against the rough wood of the stall, as though the planks might become walls strong enough to shield him from the weight of the world outside. His tiny fingers groped for something familiar, something solid to hold on to, and they found the wood, its surface coarse and uneven beneath his skin. The grooves in the wood told stories of their own, stories the boy was too young to fully understand, yet old enough to feel. They were the scars of years of work, cut into the barn by tools, by time, by hands far stronger than his own. The indentations fit awkwardly beneath his small fingertips, but he traced them again and again, as though by learning the shape of each line he could steady himself, as though the history carved there might lend him the strength of those who had once labored within these walls. Every sound outside pressed harder into him than the wood beneath his fingers. The synchronized steps of the warriors, the guttural rhythm of their chants, the flickering hiss of torches, all merged into one storm that seemed to rage not beyond the barn walls but within the cage of his ribs. He felt each sound as if it had been placed inside his chest, magnified until his small body could hardly contain it. It was as though his heart had been taken up by their rhythm, his lungs by their chant, his blood by the pulse of firelight. He was no longer a separate being, but a fragile vessel straining beneath forces too immense to hold. He tried to command himself to breathe slowly, to quiet the frantic rise and fall of his chest. He had seen animals do it, rabbits holding still in the grass, deer freezing at the crack of a twig. If they could slow their breath and become invisible, perhaps he could too. He tried to draw in air softly, to release it without sound, but his body betrayed him. His lungs dragged the air in too quickly. forcing it out in ragged bursts that seemed deafening in the silence of the barn. Each gasp sounded to him like a drumbeat, loud enough to carry through the wood and hay, loud enough for the warriors outside to hear. He pressed his small hand against his chest, willing it to calm, but the more he tried, the worse it became. His ribs fluttered like trapped birds, his heart pounded as though it sought escape, and the trembling in his limbs spread like fire down into his fingers and toes. His body was not an ally in this moment. It was a traitor, announcing his fear, in every twitch, every breath, every thump of his heart. The fear itself had a taste. The boy noticed it first as a dryness at the back of his throat, then as a metallic tense that coated his tongue. It was sharp, bitter, and heavy, unlike anything he had ever known. He swallowed, but it did not go away. It lingered, filling his mouth with the weight of iron, with the memory of blood, though none had been spilled. It was as though his body had created the taste to remind him of danger, to keep him from forgetting what was at stake. He licked his lips, but the taste only spread. It was not only in his mouth now, but in his nose, in his chest, in every corner of his being. Fear had become something physical, something he could not hide from, no more than he could hide from the warriors outside. It lived inside him, a bitter ghost haunting each breath. The barn seemed to amplify everything, his breathing, his heartbeat, the taste of fear. The walls did not protect him. They echoed him back to himself, magnified him until he could no longer pretend he was hidden. He felt as though the barn itself was betraying him, each creak of wood, each stir of hay carrying his presence outward like a signal flare. He imagined the warriors pausing in their march, turning their painted faces toward the barn, listening not with ears but with instincts sharpened by centuries. He imagined them hearing not the chant, not the fire, but the desperate flutter of a child's lungs inside a hollow wooden shell. He squeezed his eyes shut, as though darkness could make him smaller, quieter, less real. But shutting out the barn only trapped him more deeply within himself. He could feel everything too vividly, the splinters pressing into his skin where he clutched the stall, the sharp scent of hay and old wood, the faint lingering musk of animals that had long since left the place. The barn smelled of labor and abandonment, of sweat and soil, of lives that had passed through and gone. To the boy, it smelled like a world that had once been alive but was now only memory, and he was part of that memory now, trapped in it, waiting for it to shatter. The boy had no clear idea what would happen when the barn doors opened. He only knew that they would open, and that when they did, the fragile shell of safety he had wrapped around himself would break apart. He pictured the light of torches flooding in, casting his small frame into sharp relief. He imagined the chants falling silent, replaced by the single sound of the doors creaking wide, and then 200 eyes turning upon him. He imagined faces, bending close, voices speaking words he could not understand. He imagined hands reaching for him, strong and certain, lifting him from the place he had chosen to hide. He did not know if those hands would harm him or hold him. At 4 years old, he did not yet know the difference between mercy and danger, when they wore the same face of inevitability. All he knew was that the moment before the doors opened was both a reprieve and a torment. Each second that passed without the creak of hinges was a second in which he remained free, hidden, untouched. But each second was also a stretch of unbearable waiting, a tightrope pulled thinner and thinner by the weight of what was coming. The waiting itself became its own kind of suffering, sharper than the unknown that followed. He pressed his forehead against the wood of the stall, his skin cold against the rough surface. The grooves beneath his fingers dug deeper as he held on tighter, as though he could anchor himself against the tide pressing in from all sides. He was too small to understand the enormity of what surrounded him, but he was not too small to feel it, and in the marrow of his bones, he knew one truth above all others. The barn doors would open, and when they did, nothing would ever be the same again. The silence before the sound was almost unbearable. For long minutes, the boy had pressed himself against the stall, clutching at the rough wood, praying without words that the storm outside would stay beyond the walls. But then came the sound he dreaded most, the slow, aching groan of the barn doors as they began to shift against their hinges. It was not the crash of violence he had feared, but something worse, a patient, inevitable creak that told him resistance was useless. It was the sound of fate unfolding, as steady and unstoppable as the turning of the earth. The hinges wind like wounded animals, their voices high and thin, carrying through the darkness with a finality that left no doubt the world outside. With entering, the heavy wooden planks did not swing open at once. They moved gradually, reluctantly, as though the barn itself mourned the betrayal of its last secret. Thin slivers of light pierced through the widening cracks, sharp as blades, cutting the dark into fragments. At first, it was only a few threads of brightness, fragile and fleeting, but to the boy's eyes, long adjusted to the gloom, they were overwhelming. The light burned. It filled the space with brilliance too sudden, too fierce. Dust motes rose and spun in the golden shafts, swirling like tiny spirits awakened from their slumber. They danced in the air, suspended between the dark sanctuary of the barn and the blinding promise of the world beyond. The boy's small chest locked tight. His lungs seemed to forget the rhythm of breathing, as though the act itself had been stolen from him by the brilliance pouring in. He froze, not because stillness would save him, but because he no longer remembered how to move. His eyes widened, straining against the glow, yet he could not look away. The light was more than illumination, it was revelation. It was the first unveiling of a truth too large for him to understand, yet impossible for him to ignore. Somewhere deep inside, beyond the sharp bite of fear, something stirred. It was not courage, not yet merely a fragile wonder. For even as terror closed its hand around his small body, there was a part of him that could not help but marvel. The light was both enemy and miracle. It terrified him, but it also drew him, a force greater than his fear, greater than his will. He felt suspended between two worlds, the safety of shadows behind him and the consuming brilliance ahead. Then the shadow appeared. It entered first as a distortion, an absence of light stretching long and dark across the floor of the barn. It was larger than him, larger than anything he could measure, and it crept toward him with an inevitability that chilled his blood. The boy's eyes followed the shape as it grew, its edges bending, its form deepening until he knew without doubt whose it was, the elder. The shadow carried the weight of centuries. It was not merely the outline of a man, but the presence of history itself. The elder's figure was tall, his shoulders squared beneath the furs and leathers of his people. Feathers crowned his head, swaying with each breath of air, casting smaller shadows that rippled within the larger form. To the boy, it seemed as though the shadow was alive, stretching and curling, reaching for him with fingers made not of flesh but of inevitability. Every instinct told the boy to retreat further, to bury himself deeper into the stall, to disappear into the hay and wood, yet his body disobeyed. He remained frozen, caught in the gaze of a presence he could not yet see, but could already feel. The elder's shadow was a tide, and he was too small to resist its pull. The barn was no longer his. The moment the doors opened, it had ceased to belong to him. The air itself seemed to shift allegiance, carrying with it the scent of smoke, sweat, and earth from the hundreds waiting outside. Their voices had fallen silent now, but their silence was heavier than their chants had been, as though every man, every woman, every warrior held his breath in the same suspended second. The barn was a vessel, no longer holding one frightened child. It was now filled with the presence of hundreds, pressing in unseen, their collective gaze pouring through the doors. The boy's small world, once defined by wood and hay, by the shadows of his own fear, shattered in that instant. What had been his was no longer his own. He belonged, now, to the countless eyes outside, to the rhythm of feet that had marched to this place, to the fire that had burned against the night. He was no longer a child, alone in a barn. He was the center of something vast, a destiny unfolding, before he had learned to name it, and yet, within the terror, something flickered. It was faint, almost invisible, but it was there. As the elder's shadow stretched toward him, the boy felt an unfamiliar sensation stir within the pit of his chest. It was not escape, he could not run. It was not resistance, he could not fight. It was the smallest seed of recognition, a sense that this moment had been waiting for him long before he had ever arrived. The barn doors groaned wider. The light spilled fuller, the shadow deepened, and the boy, frozen between terror and wonder, felt the weight of inevitability settle upon him. He was no longer his own. His story, his breath, his very name, all of it now belonged to the 200 waiting beyond the barn, and to the destiny they had already chosen for him.